Well, look, imagine the scene. A loved one, maybe your parent or your grandparent, has passed away. You're grieving. At the same time, you're trying to sort out all the things that follow from a death. You're going through their belongings, the paperwork, and then there's a knock at the door. It's not from a well-wisher, but it's from HMRC. Hello? We've come to value your relative's estate. That is what Andy Burnham's scheme could mean. The taxman intruding on the private grief of hundreds of thousands of regular families every year right across the country. It's the tax that Andy Burnham conspicuously refused to rule out yesterday. A universal death tax. A tax that he has been pushing for nigh on 20 years. In a white paper as Health Secretary in 2010, in his first leadership bid in 2015, in 2021 at a fringe meeting, in the Makerfield by-election, everything was on the table. And as the Prime Minister says, difficult decisions are coming. He's ruled out plenty of other taxes, but he won't, he can't, he will not rule out the death tax. It's a tax that the public has rejected, not once, not twice, but 4 separate times. Yet still Andy Burnham seems to return to it. Why? Not just because he wants to change social care, no. If that was his sole aim, there are other ways to fund it, like cutting foreign aid or benefits for migrants. No. He's shown again and again that he thinks the savings that you've earned, no matter how little, that you've scrimped and saved for, that you've been taxed on, whether you're rich or poor, he says the taxman deserves a bit more. No one doubts that Andy Burnham possesses more charm than Keir Starmer. I know that's a low bar. But have we stopped to ask, what is he actually selling? On the big questions so far, there's a bunch of false promises and fantasy ideas that he can fix social care and worry about the costs another time, or that he can grow the economy in every postcode for British people, but water down immigration reforms to let in some more cheap migrant workers. And finally, that 700 people can cross the channel in small boats yesterday, tens of thousands this year, and that means his government's plan is actually working. He's like Labour's answer to the Pied Piper. He's playing an enticing tune, but actually leading them and our country into more desperate trouble. I'm not surprised that Nigel Farage was the only party leader that Andy Burnham wouldn't invite to discuss his idea. Despite the fact that reform provides £8 billion of social care through the 30 councils that we run. Because Andy Burnham knows, rightly to be fair, that Nigel will never go along with a betrayal of people who've paid in their whole lives. And make no mistake, that is what Andy Burnham is planning to do. That is the purpose of the talks that the other parties are now engaged in. Andy Burnham says that difficult decisions lie ahead. But let's be honest. That is Westminster politicians speak for tax rises lie ahead. Why not just be straight with people? Going after hard-working Brits on modest salaries with only a little in savings is the exact opposite of what reform stands for. We stand for protecting British workers and putting them first. And as people begin to consider what this means for them and their family, many will understandably be very worried. Why can't he be straight with them? Why can't he just say what he is actually planning to do? Why cause them all this uncertainty and worry? Let me tell you how a universal death tax would actually work. Why this is a cruel and punitive tax. Today, whatever its faults, and clearly inheritance tax has many, it at least has a threshold. So that means that if you saved a little over the years, hundreds of pounds, a few £1,000, or indeed a larger amount, up to £325,000 as an individual, you can pass that on to your family. Andy Burnham's levy is different. It has no threshold, no allowance, no minimum limit whatsoever. Everything goes in. The family heirlooms, your mother's wedding ring, if you've got a watch to hand on, and nothing else, it's taxed. A couple of pieces of jewelry, taxed. Even clothes, taxed. Think what that means. Think what that means for the least well-off families in this country. An estate of a few £100 in a post office account. A bit of furniture, the sofa, the telly, a small policy would somehow have to be catalogued, valued, and assessed. By who? Solicitors? Probate valuers? Officials? What, people charging fees for the smallest estates? The cost of the assessment alone might swallow the inheritance in whole. The state would spend £500 to take £300. Grieving families would undoubtedly be dragged through months of paperwork for the privilege of being left with next to nothing. And remember, this is the important point. Brits are already amongst the most heavily taxed people on earth when we die. Of the 38 OECD nations, Britain already runs the 5th harshest death tax regime. Nearly half of those countries don't tax children's inheritance at all, and rightly so. Australia scrapped death duties. Canada scrapped them. Even Sweden scrapped them because they raised very little, because they were despised, because they destroyed a lot. And Andy Burnham looks at all that. He looks at all of that and concludes, you know what? Britain doesn't tax death enough. To raise the £18 billion he needs for his plans, this tax would need to sit on top of the inheritance tax levied on the rich. That means together, Burnham's death tax and our existing inheritance tax would cost families almost £30 billion a year. Britain would become the single worst place to give money to your kids in the Western world. And it would be worse than that, because it would also make the UK the only country in the whole of the West to tax all savings with no allowance whatsoever. This is a truly extreme proposal. Is this the Makerfield test that we were promised by Andy Burnham when he was out on the stump? Well, take a nurse. Take a nurse in Makerfield who's worked her whole life in the NHS. She passes away. Maybe she passes away far too young, only a few years after retiring. She owns a house in Makerfield worth £200,000. She's not rich, but she worked hard and she saved for that home. She gets a lump sum of £100,000 on death from the NHS pension scheme. Under the current rules, none of that would be taxed. And I think we can all agree, quite right so. But under Andy Burnham's death tax, her children would have to pay £30,000 to the taxman, plus the form filling, the worry, the things they'd have to do when they should be grieving for their lost mother. I sometimes wonder if people in the political and media establishment think people are swimming in money out there in the real world. Most people don't inherit very much money at all. And the poorest in society inherit very small sums. but it makes a very big difference to their lives, particularly at times like this, where people are finding life tough. In fact, when the poorest 20% get an inheritance, it makes up 44% of their wealth. Are you going to tax that and make their family account for it to HMRC? And who would actually pay for it? It's not going to be the rich. The rich have family offices. They have offshore structures. They have accountants on retainers. They will have planned their way around this levy long before the bill has even reached its first reading in Parliament. We all know that. We've seen this before. A flat tax with no floor doesn't catch the millionaires or the billionaires. It catches the widow in the bungalow. It catches the elderly pensioner with the savings book. The Duke keeps his estate, the dinner lady loses hers. It's always the same way. The clever money moves, the honest money pays. And think finally of the sheer indignity of it all. An official standing in your late mother's bedroom with a clipboard, pricing up her engagement ring, the brooch that you'd always admired and she said would be yours, that you'd carry to remember her. The taxman totting up her coats in her wardrobe, itemizing a life that's been characterized by work, thrift, prudence, love of family, so that the treasury can take its cut. And then what of all the unanswered questions? Will farmers be exempted? Or will they face yet another attack? What of family businesses? We're surely not going to repeat all the angst for them that Rachel Reeves created last year. 2026 will be marked by protests of tractors on Whitehall, just as 2024 and 2025 were. Will husbands and wives have to pay when the other dies? They did under Andy Burnham's white paper. People are worried now, and they can't wait a year for an answer. Now others will ask, how else do we pay for care? Because we all see the flaws of the present system. Nobody denies that. Nobody's blind to the problems. Nobody who's watched a parent pass through it could deny it. I have, as an MP, as a grandson, and more recently as a son. I don't doubt the Prime Minister's sincerity either. The system needs to change, but not necessarily the change that he's looking at. For a Prime Minister who's claimed that he cares about localism, it is striking that his first big policy is not to devolve, but to build a national bureaucracy that takes power from local councils. Care in Haringey will always be different to care in Herefordshire, and rightly so. He's going to create another office full of bureaucrats deciding who gets what. The government is currently trying and failing to abolish NHS England, a giant overbearing quango. And what? We're going to create another one for NHS care? I'm not at all convinced that this will help anyone to get better quality care. And that is what we should care about. I also want to ensure that we end the evident profiteering from the system. Large private equity-backed care home companies extracting money, sometimes fleecing families and local councils. I've spoken this week to reform-controlled councils who've told me about a care company hiking prices when they need to get somebody into a bed late at night on a Friday, charging exorbitant bills out of all proportion. That has to stop. But I'm not at all convinced that Andy Burnham's proposal is going to fix that. Here's 3 better ways, in fact. First, The system needs to talk to itself. Today, a hospital in one town can barely read the records of a care home in the next. Discharge notes are printed off. They're still faxed, for goodness sake. Faxed in 2026 in some parts of the system. They're typed by hand. Elderly patients are marooned in beds for weeks, costing thousands of pounds a week, because the NHS and the care system can't pass a simple file between them. One patient, one record, from ward to care home to GP. End the block beds, the botched discharges, and the savings run into billions. The one system we had that seemed to be fixing this problem was a technology system provided by a company called Palantir. It reduces discharge delays by 15%. And what is Burnham proposing to do? Well, he said that he's considering scrapping it from the NHS. Scrapping the one thing that seems to be working. Well, why? Because the same firm apparently sells technology to the Israelis, and the British Islamists were unhappy about it. So to play to the gallery, get a few votes back, he's going to scrap the tech that's actually working to help discharge in hospitals. That doesn't sound to me like the actions of a man who cares about fixing things, who puts delivery above ideology. Second, the second way to fix this is to scrap the waste and spend it on care. Before this government spends a penny from a dead pensioner's estate, it can take the billions we hand every year in foreign aid. As Chancellor in a reform government, I could not look the British taxpayer in the eye and impose a tax, another tax, take a penny off them in tax, before I had stopped sending taxpayers' money to rich countries overseas. How about stopping spending billions in benefits for those who've never paid in? Or the millions a day in hotels for channel migrants, or the quangos that nobody voted for, the consultants on £1,000 a day that we see across the public sector, the layers of NHS management that have never once emptied a bedpan. That is not simply about spending more. This country does not lack money for care. It lacks a government with the courage and determination to put its own people first. And thirdly, and here is one point on which Andy Burnham and I agree, pay care workers properly. Care is skilled, demanding, often heartbreaking work, and today it is scandalously underpaid. Care workers have been treated like dirt by successive governments, especially during the pandemic. A very good friend of mine, who was a care worker during that time, used to phone my wife and I and cry down the phone line. She felt no one cared, not her employer, not the government. These people deserve better. Reform exists for decent, hard-working people like this who are being let down day in, day out, but continue to get up early in the morning to go to work, to put their heart and soul into their job, for the good of the community and for the good of their family. But here's the truth that no other party will say. You cannot raise the wages of British care workers while importing a limitless supply of cheap labour to undercut them. This is precisely what has happened. Hundreds of thousands recruited from overseas on wages no British worker could live on, while the sector went nowhere. The soft bigotry of low expectations, in which it's said by the establishment that no self-respecting Brit would do this work. Therefore, we must import cheap labour from overseas. 80% of care workers are Brits. We should be on their side. End the undercutting of their wages. Pay a decent wage to carers so that they can raise a family on it, and make it affordable for people to care for their own families. Family, community, country, those are the principles on which reform is built. Do that, and you will discover that Britain doesn't have a shortage of carers. It has a shortage of respect for carers, and reform will fix that. Let me end with this. Think what this whole episode says about our politics. A tax that the public has rejected 4 times. And each time the political class waits a few years, changes the wrapping paper, and asks the same question again. This is how broken Westminster has become. The people gave their answer, and the system simply rejects it and repeats the same question. Reform is different. We believe that money taxed when you earned it, taxed when you saved it, and taxed when you spent it should not be taxed a 4th time when you're laid to rest. We believe a family's home is a legacy. It's not a revenue stream. We believe that the proper response of the British state to the death of someone in their family is sympathy, not a valuation, not a knock on the door by the taxman. Andy Burnham may see this as his legacy, but your legacy is not his to take. It is your legacy, not his. So here is Reform's pledge. We will fight this tax, not as opposition for opposition's sake, but because it is unfair, impractical, and cruel on the people of this country. Because it cuts to the heart of something we in Reform understand is a deep human emotion. The desire to own a home, the desire to pass on what little you've saved to your children and your grandchildren. Because when we say we're change, we mean it. Hard-working Brits come first, every time. My message to Andy Burnham: rule out this tax. End the uncertainty. End the worry. Today. If not, don't ask Westminster. Ask the public. Call a general election. Thank you very much indeed.